The Aethelgard High Sanctum was a monument to 12,000 years of diplomatic victories and shared history. It was a vault containing the genetic records of 10,000 species, a place of absolute neutrality where war was a concept left at the airlock. However, High Sovereign Mal-Goran of the Zenthori Hegemony did not believe in neutrality. He believed in the mathematics of conquest, overwhelming force, and the immediate occupation of high-value assets. As the Zenthori Armada, consisting of 3,000 warships, materialized at the edge of the system, the galaxy watched in terror. The Hegemony's boarding pods pierced the Sanctum's hull with clinical precision. Mal-Goran's scanners reported no military presence, only a handful of bipedal primitives in gray maintenance jumpsuits. To the Zenthori, humans were the galaxy's janitors. Convenient, helpful, and seemingly infinite in their patience. In the heart of the Central Archive, Kaelen Voss was monitoring waste reclamation reports when the alarms began to scream. It was a pitch reserved for catastrophic security breaches, yet Kaelen felt no need to rush. He simply continued his work, even as 12 Zenthori Shadow Guard, elite killers with exoskeletons capable of shrugging off small arms fire, kicked down the blast doors. "You are in a restricted data integrity zone," Kaelen said, without looking up, his voice carrying the exhausted certainty of 30 years of service. "The floor was just waxed. I'd recommend stepping back before you scuff the finish." The lead Shadow Guard paused, his thermal sensors searching for a hidden weapon. He found only a middle-aged human with graying temples and a ceramic mug. The Zenthori rumbled with condescension, a gurgling sound that signaled they viewed this primate as nothing more than biological waste. "The Hegemony now owns this vault, human," the guard hissed, raising a combat blade. "Move, or your genetic code will be the first deleted." Kaelen Voss finally looked up. He didn't offer a threat display or a roar. He simply checked his chronometer and sighed. Looking directly into a hidden security feed, he addressed the High Sovereign watching from the flagship. "High Sovereign Mal-Goran," Kaelen began calmly, "this is your first and only polite request. Do not attempt to access the restricted files. Our Annoyance protocol is currently at Stage 1. I strongly suggest you keep it there." On the flagship Obsidian, Mal-Goran erupted in laughter, his mandibles clicking in amusement at the mythical human menace. "Stage 1? Is that a threat, janitor? I have an empire behind me. You have a mop." At the Sovereign's command, the guard reached out to smash Kaelen's terminal. Kaelen didn't flinch. He simply took a slow breath, his eyes hardening into something that reminded the sensors of compressed neutronium. "Right," Kaelen muttered. "Stage 2, then." Suddenly, the lights flickered from a serene blue to a harsh, industrial amber. The station's voice, usually melodic, distorted into a deep, predatory rumble. "Warning, unauthorized access. Recalibrating environmental controls to Earth-standard Death World parameters." Mal-Goran's smug expression vanished as the gravity in the station doubled instantly. The oxygen mix spiked with nitrogen-heavy pollutants. Refreshing to a human, but corrosive to almost every other known species. The elite Zenthori guards began to wheeze, their exoskeletons groaning under the crushing weight of a 2G environment. Kaelen Voss stood up, picked up his mop, and stepped over the struggling elite killers as if they were nothing more than debris. "I told you to be careful," Kaelen said, his voice now cold enough to cut through hull plating. "Now I'm actually getting annoyed." High Sovereign Mal-Goran watched the tactical feed from the Obsidian, his secondary heart thrumming with an unfamiliar sensation. Genuine panic. On the screens, his elite Shadow Guard, warriors who had conquered 17 civilizations, were currently pinned to the floor of the Central Archive by the crushing weight of doubled gravity. Their respiratory filters were clogged with the nitrogen-heavy Death World atmosphere that the human Custodian, Kaelen Voss, was currently breathing with casual ease. "Technician, restore the environment!" Mal-Goran roared, his mandibles trembling. "The primate is sabotaging the station. Sir, we can't." The technician's voice was a frantic chitter. "The station's core isn't responding to our overrides. It's running a diagnostic subroutine on human, standard comfort levels. It says our species is a biological contaminant that needs to be quarantined." While the Hegemony's command deck descended into chaos, a single, unshielded human shuttle drifted toward Docking Bay 9. It bore no military markings, only the crest of the Terran Commerce Guild. A man stepped out wearing a simple, sharp suit and carrying a data tablet. This was Senior Auditor Reed. "Identify yourself, primate." Mal-Goran screamed through the station's intercom. "I have 3,000 warships. One more step and I will glass this entire sector." Reed didn't look up from his tablet. He adjusted his glasses and stepped over a gasping Zenthori guard who was trying to crawl toward a weapon. "Actually, High Sovereign, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to discuss the occupation liability and resource consumption fees." "Fees?" Mal-Goran sputtered, his optical sensors widening in disbelief. "I am conquering this station. Technically, you're trespassing in a restricted access repository," Reed corrected pleasantly, his voice a sharp contrast to the sirens. "And while our custodian, Mr. Voss, is quite patient, I'm afraid your Stage 2 entry into the archives has triggered a mandatory logistical assessment. You see, war is essentially just mathematics and accounting." Reed tapped his tablet, and the Obsidian's main view screen flickered. It wasn't showing a weapon lock, it was showing a spreadsheet. "Your flagship's fuel consumption just increased by 400% due to the gravity shift," Reed explained. "Your oxygen scrubbers will fail in precisely 17 minutes. And the annoyance tax for scuffing the waxed floors of a Type 12 Death World maintenance zone is... well, it's quite steep." Mal-Goran looked at his tactical officer. The officer nodded, his skin a pale shade of terror. The human was right. They weren't being shot at. They were being out-calculated. "You think a bill will stop me?" Mal-Goran hissed. "Not the bill," Reed said, his smile disappearing as he looked toward the central archive. "But you really shouldn't have touched the restricted files. They aren't just data. You've just woken up something that hasn't seen the surface in 8,000 years." Deep beneath the archive's floor, a rhythmic thud began to shake the station's very foundation. A sound that was unmistakably a massive, ancient heartbeat. Senior Auditor Reed adjusted his spectacles as the station's vibration intensified, the deep, rhythmic thudding rattling the ceramic mug Kaelen Voss had left on the terminal. High Sovereign Mal-Goran, viewing the feed from his command throne on the Obsidian, let out a sound of dismissive disgust that crackled through the archive speakers. "Your heartbeat games do not frighten me, primate." Mal-Goran spat, even as his tactical officers reported internal sensors detecting energy signatures that were off the scale. The warlord remained convinced that humans were merely prey pretending to be predators, species that negotiated only because they feared conflict. Mal-Goran barked an order for his remaining shadow guard to execute the Auditor, but Reed didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even move. "You're still thinking like a warrior," Reed said, his voice carrying the same exhausted certainty found in human diplomatic records. "You see a battle, but we see a logistical error. You've introduced thousands of unauthorized variables into a closed system. For example, your Shadow Guard are currently blocking the path of the station's scheduled cleaning cycles. As the Zenthori killers lunged, the ceiling panels hissed open. Thousands of small, multi-limbed maintenance drones dropped into the archive. To the Zenthori, these were just automated mining equipment, or weather satellites. Primitive tools for waste reclamation that posed no threat to armored warriors. They were wrong. The drones moved with surgical precision and coordinated grace. Their movements choreographed years in advance. They didn't fire blasters. They used high-frequency cutting tools, originally designed for precision hull repair, to systematically unmake the Zenthori exoskeletons. It wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration that resistance was impossible because the humans had already calculated every move the Zenthori would make. In less than a minute, the archive was cleared of hostiles, the elite guard neutralized without a single human firing a shot. "These are just cleaning bots," Mal-Goran screamed, his mandibles clicking in a stress response, usually reserved for existential crises. "Actually," Reed corrected, glancing at his tablet as if checking an invoice, "they're surgical extraction units now. We've found that the best way to handle biological contaminants is to remove them before they damage the genetic records." Reed's eyes flicked to the archive's restricted vault as the rhythmic thudding shifted into a mechanical grinding of ancient gears. "And now, High Sovereign, you've done it. By attempting to purge the inferior data, you've successfully moved us to Stage 3. Mal-Goran watched in horror as the Obsidian sensors picked up a massive energy spike from the station's exterior. It wasn't a fleet arriving, it was the station itself. The docking rings were unfolding, revealing massive defensive installations that had been masquerading as space debris for millennia. "What is that?" Mal-Goran whispered, his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in a tsunami. "That?" Kaelen Voss's voice crackled over the comms from the maintenance sublevel. is the reason humans were given the keys to this place. We aren't here to keep the peace. We're here to keep the things inside from getting out. And you just broke the lock. High Sovereign Mal-Goran's breathing grew ragged as the Obsidian's bridge shook under a new type of assault. It wasn't a bombardment of plasma or missiles. It was a rhythmic, systemic failure of his fleet's core systems. On his tactical display, 3,000 Zenthori warships, the finest military force in 3 galactic quadrants, began to flicker and fade. They weren't being destroyed. They were being unmade. Sovereign, we are losing reactor containment across the entire Vanguard. His tactical officer shrieked, his skin rippling with profound unease. The humans. They aren't firing weapons. They're transmitting logistical override codes. They've bypassed our encryption as if it were a children's story. Senior Auditor Reed stood calmly in the archive, his eyes fixed on his data tablet while the surgical extraction drones finished clearing the room. He looked up at the ceiling speakers, his voice a sharp, clinical contrast to the chaos. You see, Mal-Goran, you made the same catastrophically stupid assumption as those before you, Reed said, his tone echoing the exhausted certainty of decades of diplomatic service. You assumed that because we requested the back row of the council, we were nobody important. But we chose that position because it gave us the best sightlines in the house. While you were busy posturing in the front, we were mapping your reality. Reed tapped a command on his tablet, and the Obsidian's main view screen shifted from the station to a galactic map. Red icons pulsed across Zenthori territory, not on military bases, but on fuel depots, nursery worlds, and critical infrastructure hubs. We have spent the last 73 cycles studying every single species in this council, Reed continued, his smile now sharp as a blade. We know your supply lines, your ammunition expenditure patterns, and exactly how many cycles it takes for your species to face economic disruption. We aren't fighting a war, Sovereign. We're performing an audit. Mal-Goran clutched his command throne, his pride crumbling like a sandcastle in a tsunami. He realized now that the humans hadn't just gotten lucky. They had practiced tactical prescience, calculating every move his fleet would make before the first shot was even fired. You would start a war over a library? Mal-Goran gurgled, his arrogance replaced by existential dread. War is messy and expensive, Reed replied, stepping toward the center of the archive as the floor began to retract. But humanity is very good at mathematics, and we've decided that your existence has become economically irrational. We prefer peace, but we default to our other specialization when forced. Kaelen Voss's voice cut through the comms, no longer the tired custodian, but something ancient and predatory. Stage 3 is complete, Reed. The vault is open. Mal-Goran watched as the station's central spire didn't just open. It unfolded into a humanoid entity of living metal that stood 300 meters tall, its eyes burning with fusion reactions. It was a titan, a locked-away nightmare that humanity had kept hidden since before the Zenthori discovered fire. The titan didn't reach for a weapon. It reached for the obsidian itself. You wanted the restricted files, Mal-Goran? Kaelen hissed. Meet the author. High Sovereign Mal-Goran watched as the Titan's living metal fingers brushed the hull of his flagship, the Obsidian. The contact was not a strike. It was a caress that caused the most advanced alloy in the Zenthori hegemony to unmake itself on a conceptual level, atoms simply forgetting how to bond. Inside the bridge, the Sovereign was no longer shouting. He was staring at a small screen that showed the central archive, where a Zenthori commander, driven to hysterical laughter by the breakdown of reality, had just committed a fatal error. The commander had reached out and smashed Kaelen Voss's ceramic mug, the one that read, World's Okayest Custodian, sending shards of clay and the scent of toxic coffee across the waxed floor. Kaelen Voss stopped moving. He didn't roar, and he didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the broken shards, then at the pale gray faceplates of the Zenthori commander, and took a long, slow breath through his nose. That was my favorite mug, Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried through every speaker in the Zenthori fleet. My daughter made that for me. It was a gift for Father's Day. What will you do, little human? The Zenthori commander hissed, though his auditory membranes were flaring with instinctive fear. Write a strongly worded letter? No, Kaelen replied, looking directly into the camera with eyes that reminded Mal-Goran of compressed neutronium. Now I'm actually getting annoyed. In the galactic community, the Annoyance Protocol was a legend, a cultural sensitivity seminar topic that most warlords ignored until it was too late. It was the last warning before humans stopped being predators who chose to become diplomats and started solving problems the efficient way instead of the nice way. On the Obsidian, Senior Auditor Reed's tablet chimed. "Oh dear," Reed murmured, not looking up. "He's bypassed Stage 3. We are now in creative disassembly territory." Suddenly, the 23 human warships that had been patiently watching from the edge of the system didn't jump in. They simply uncloaked. They had been there the entire time, cold and silent, hiding in plain sight within the station's own sensor ghosts. These weren't the trainee squadrons or diplomatic protection details the Hegemony was used to. These were the varsity team, the Earth Defense Fleet's specialized surgical strike wing. "Sovereign!" the tactical officer cried out, his skin rippling with frustration. "The human ships, they aren't targeting our weapons. They're targeting our life support umbilical and fuel consumption regulators. They're treating us like a logistics problem." "We don't want to destroy you, Mal-Goran." Kaelen's voice echoed, now cold and infinitely more dangerous. "Destroying things is messy, expensive, and bad for everyone. But you broke the rules, you touched the files, and you broke my mug." The Titan's hand closed around the Obsidian's primary engine block. Mal-Goran felt the ship groan, not from a physical squeeze, but from a coordinated cyber attack that was rewriting his ship's very purpose. "What do you want?" Mal-Goran shrieked, his pride crumbling. "I want you to understand the mathematics of your mistake," Kaelen said. "And then I want you to meet the people who are going to audit your homeworld." As the Obsidian systems went dark, a new set of contacts appeared on the long-range sensors. They weren't warships. They were massive industrial harvesters, bearing the insignia of the Terran Reconstruction Authority. The question wasn't whether the Zenthori would survive the battle. The question was, how much of their empire would be left once the humans finished reclaiming the debt? High Sovereign Mal-Goran stared at his flickering tactical displays as the Obsidian groaned under the Titan's grip. His fleet, once an overwhelming force, was now a herd of confused predators being stalked by something they couldn't even quantify. The Sovereign desperately keyed his transmission to the archive. "You cannot do this. This station belongs to the Galactic Council. It is neutral ground." Senior Auditor Reed didn't look up from his tablet, even as the walls of the archive began to slide away, revealing the cold black of space. "Neutrality is a choice, Sovereign. One you revoked 11 minutes and 42 seconds ago," Reed said, his voice flat. "And as for the station, it's not exactly a station. It's a specialized containment chassis." Outside, the Aethelgard High Sanctum was no longer a ring of peaceful libraries. It was unfolding with a terrible grace that should have been impossible for something so massive. The entire structure was a biomechanical hybrid, a titan whose scale dwarfed even the dreadnoughts of the Zenthori hegemony. Its living metal skin pulsed with light patterns that hurt to perceive, and its fusion eyes burned with the intensity of supernova detonations. "Sir, we're receiving a new transmission," the tactical officer shrieked. "It's not from the Custodian, it's a priority alpha signal from the Terran Defense Coalition." The holographic display materialized the face of a human woman in a sharp military uniform, Admiral Evelyn Cross. She looked remarkably calm, as if she were monitoring a chess tournament rather than an interstellar war. "High Sovereign Mal-Goran," Admiral Cross began, her voice holding a promise of future violence. "I am Admiral Cross of the TDC Varsity Fleet. We were in the neighborhood for routine exercises when we heard our Custodian was having a bit of a problem with biological contaminants." "Varsity Fleet?" Mal-Goran gurgled, his eyes reflecting the living metal entity outside his window. "Yes," Cross said with a thin smile. "You've spent the last hour playing with our janitors and auditors. It was excellent training for them, but honestly, if we let this go on much longer, the paperwork for trauma counseling becomes a nightmare. We've decided to step in and handle this efficiently." The Admiral gestured, and 23 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel with military precision surrounding the Zenthori fleet. These weren't the trainee vessels marked with orange training stripes. These were sleek predatory capital ships, their weapon locks intensifying as they painted every Zenthori ship simultaneously. You have 60 seconds to begin a full retreat to your core territories, Admiral Cross announced, her voice hardening like steel. If a single shot is fired, we proceed to total extermination of your military capabilities. We will not negotiate. Mal-Goran looked at the Titan holding his ship, then at the massive carrier that blotted out the nearest star. His pride had evaporated like moisture in a vacuum. And Sovereign, Kaelen Voss's voice cut back in. Don't forget about the late fees. We've already sent our logistics coordinators to your homeworld to start the audit. As the 60-second timer began to count down, the Titan's grip tightened, and Mal-Goran realized that the myth of human patience was exactly that. A story told to keep the monsters at bay until they were ready to eat. The 60-second timer on the Obsidian's bridge hit 0 with a silence that was colder than the void. High Sovereign Mal-Goran, paralyzed by the sight of the 300-meter Titan clutching his flagship, failed to issue the retreat order. He still clung to the illusion that his 3,000 warships represented a military force, capable of holding the station. "Time's up," Admiral Cross said, her voice clinical and crisp. "Commence the 11-minute audit." What followed was not a battle, but a demonstration of tactical prescience. The human fleet didn't open fire with traditional plasma cannons. Instead, they targeted the Zenthori fleet through sympathetic frequency harmonics. On every Zenthori ship, the reactor containment didn't fail due to damage. It was remotely deactivated because the humans had already calculated the exact fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure patterns of the Hegemony. "Sir, our shields are... they're expiring," the tactical officer screamed, as the Obsidian's defensive screen simply ceased to exist. The humans had used predictive algorithms to identify the exact vulnerable points in the Zenthori battle formation that should have been theoretical weaknesses, known only to the Hegemony's own computers. They weren't fighting, they were destroying illusions about warfare itself. In the archive, Senior Auditor Reed watched the logistical unmaking on his tablet. The Zenthori military is now statistically unlikely to maintain a presence in this sector. He noted to Kaelen Voss, "Their supply chain dynamics have been redirected to Earth-contracted reclamation zones." Mal-Goran watched in stunned silence as his 3,000 ships were systematically incapacitated and neutralized, without a single human ship taking a scratch. The humans had turned a zero-sum conflict into a positive-sum logistical extraction. The Zenthori fleet wasn't destroyed, it was bankrupt. Its entire deep space hauling capacity now unavailable to the Sovereign. "You aren't just winning a war," Mal-Goran whispered, as the Titan began to unfurl further, its metal skin shifting to reflect the constituent atoms of his paralyzed fleet. "We're ending all future fighting decisively and permanently," Kaelen Voss replied, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. "You asked for military strategy, Sovereign. We gave you accounting." As the 11th minute ended, the long-range sensors picked up a massive energy signature, emerging from the Zenthori homeworld. It wasn't a bombardment, it was a Terran reconstruction signal. "What have you done?" Mal-Goran shrieked. "We negotiated with your infrastructure," Reed said, checking his watch. "Your homeworld just signed our comprehensive trade agreements. You are now humanity's newest trading partner, whether you want it to be or not." Mal-Goran's deck began to vibrate as a massive contact emerged not from space but from the archive's restricted vault behind Kaelen. Something that had been asleep for millennia and was now hungry and furious. "We promised them the galaxy," Kaelen whispered, staring at the vault. "And now they've come to collect the debt." The entity that slithered out of the archive's restricted vault did not have a shape that the Zenthori mind could comfortably process. It existed in layers of quantum probability, its presence causing the very air of the station to recoil, as reality itself was rejected on a conceptual level. High Sovereign Mal-Goran watched from his darkening bridge as the entity looked at his paralyzed fleet. Ships did not explode. They simply became less real, their atoms forgetting how to bond until they were nothing but expanding debris clouds of scrap metal and frozen corpses. "This is the Pacific horror," Kaelen Voss whispered into the comms, his voice carrying the weight of 3 billion graves. "We kept it locked away because we feared what it represents. The proof that we made bargains with things that should not exist just to survive our own world." "Please stop it," Mal-Goran begged, his arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the terrified being beneath. "We surrender. Unconditional surrender. We will meet any terms. The surrender is accepted, Admiral Cross announced from the TDC flagship, her expression unreadable. But surrender means cooperation. It means opening your archives and turning over every individual on our red list for trial. Senior Auditor Reed tapped his tablet, closing the logistical override programs that had bankrupted the Zenthori fleet. Human justice for genocide isn't death, Sovereign, Reed explained, his voice returning to its pleasant, clinical tone. It means you will spend the rest of your very long lives, kept alive by our excellent medical technology, thinking about what you did. We will ensure you never... The Titan holding the obsidian finally released its grip. The massive station began to fold back into its peaceful, ringed configuration, the living metal eyes of the entity dimming as it returned to its locked-away sleep. The varsity team of human warships began to spin up their faster-than-light drives, their mission of creative disassembly complete. You defeated us through accounting, Mal-Goran muttered, staring at the debris of his pride. We defeated you because we understand the difference between our civilization and our nature, Kaelen Voss replied, standing among the shards of his broken mug. We've built a peaceful society because we chose to, not because we're incapable of anything else. We are apex predators with table manners. 1 week later, the Aethelgard High Sanctum was silent again. The floors were freshly waxed, and the gravity had been restored to its gentle baseline. Kaelen Voss sat at his terminal, processing a new waste reclamation report. Beside him sat a new ceramic mug, delivered by a TDC shuttle. It was a simple hand-painted piece that read, World's Okayest Custodian, Debt Paid. High Sovereign Mal-Goran was no longer a sovereign. He was now the senior intern for the Sanctum's maintenance department, tasked with logistically mapping the very archives he had tried to purge. He would spend the next century learning the mathematics of peace. As Silas Vance, now known to the galaxy as the man who held the keys to Nightmare, took a sip of his coffee, he looked at the back row of the archive's seating. 5 humans sat there quietly, watching the galaxy learn to see. Never judge a species by how they act in peacetime, Silas muttered to himself, echoing an ancient cardinal rule of warfare. Because the being that offers you tea in their home might be the same one that paints their walls with your history when you threaten their family. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humans weren't the janitors of the stars. They were the ones who made sure the darkness stayed in the basement. And they were really good at being patient until they weren't. 50 years had passed since the day the Zenthori Hegemony ceased to be an empire and became a wholly owned subsidiary of Terran Reconstruction. For Mal-Goran, the former High Sovereign, time had become a slow, rhythmic cycle of data entry and corridor maintenance. He no longer wore obsidian armor. He wore the gray, stain-resistant jumpsuit of a junior maintenance officer. He was the senior intern of the Aethelgard High Sanctum, and in 5 decades of scrubbing floors and filing genetic reports, he had learned more about power than he ever had from a command throne. It was a Tuesday, the day for waste reclamation reports, when Mal-Goran found the ghost file. He was working in the deepest sub-basement of the archive, a place even the Pacific horror seemed to avoid. His clearance, granted by decades of obedient service, allowed him to access a terminal that hadn't been touched since the station's construction. As he swiped his ID, a single unencrypted folder appeared. It wasn't labeled with a species name or a military code. It was labeled Project Nursery. Mal-Goran's secondary heart skipped a beat. He opened it. The file did not contain records of the 10,000 species as equals or neighbors. Instead, it contained developmental logs. He saw the Zenthori, his own people, listed not as a proud warrior race, but as Specimen 402. Aggression-based evolutionary track. Requires periodic culling to prevent system instability. He saw the Valdrians, the Horus, and the Krell. Every great empire was nothing more than a localized experiment in a controlled environment. But it was the author of the logs that shattered his mind. The logs weren't written by the Galactic Council. They weren't written by the divine beings the Zenthori once worshipped. They were signed by a single recurring entity, the Soul Custodial Group. Looking for something, Mal-Goran? The voice was quiet, raspy with age, but still carried the weight of a 1,000-ton press. Mal-Goran turned to find Kaelen Voss leaning against a conduit, a new mug in his hand. Kaelen looked older, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes were still 2 points of unyielding neutronium. We aren't the authors, Mal-Goran whispered, his hand trembling as he pointed at the screen. The 10,000 species. We aren't the masters of the galaxy. We're the... Kaelen took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at the screen. Livestock is a bit harsh. I prefer the term seedlings. You see, Mal-Goran, humans didn't find the Aethelgard sanctum. We built it. 12,000 years before your species figured out how to sharpen a rock. We were already tired of war. We had reached the end of our own evolution, and we found the galaxy empty and lonely. Mal-Goran's breath hitched. So you created us? We planted the seeds, Kaelen corrected gently. We gave you the genetic nudges, the sacred histories, and the neutral zones to see if you could grow into something better than we were. We took the back row of the council, not because we were new, but because we were the parents watching a school play. We didn't want to lead you, we wanted to see if you could lead yourselves. And when we failed? Mal-Goran asked, thinking of his own failed conquest. When we attacked the sanctum? Then the janitor has to clean up the mess, Kaelen said, his voice turning cold. We keep the keys and the annoyance protocols to make sure the garden doesn't choke itself to death. We act like the predators with table manners because that's the only language you seedlings understand when you get too ambitious. Kaelen walked over to the terminal and deleted the ghost file with a single tap. The galaxy isn't ready for the truth yet, Kaelen said, turning to leave. They need to believe they are the masters of their own destiny. It keeps them growing. But you've been a good intern, Mal-Goran. You've earned the right to know why you're really scrubbing these floors. What now? Mal-Goran asked, feeling the weight of the entire galaxy's history pressing down on his shoulders. Kaelen Voss paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder with a small, knowing smile. The terrifyingly patient smile of a gardener who had seen 10,000 springs. Now? You finished the waste reclamation report. It's Tuesday, after all. And Mal-Goran? Yes, Custodian? Don't forget to wax the floor in the restricted vault. The author likes it when things shine. As the door hissed shut, Mal-Goran picked up his mop. He looked at the vast, silent archive around him, a library of 1,000 children, tended by the only species that had been brave enough to grow up and stay behind to keep the lights on. He began to mop, his movements mechanical and tired, yet filled with a new, terrifying purpose. The galaxy was a garden, and God was holding a mop.